the mental health of the past to the future. Every story has a beginning, whether it be good or bad. Today, I will be giving a PowerPoint on the various treatments of mental health and early stages about the thought process and the opinions of the public has on various mental health. While we, as of today, see it as a daily fight and something that we are conquering throughout the days, that does not mean the past people looked with it with disgust and with other various intentions. The beginning of change. The first mental asylum was created back in the early as 1247 AD. Known as the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, a public mental asylum wasn't open until 1811 after the 1808 County Asylums Act, which allowed counties to tax a rate to fund for constructions of county asylums. This was used in Europe. The Bethlehem Royal Hospital didn't accept their first mentally ill patient until 1407. Before the Madhouse Act of 1774, you didn't need a license to have a facility to hold patients with mental problems, which people wouldn't care for the patients nor attempt to treat patients. And those private facilities were only accessible to the wealthy, which also a lot of people suffering from mental problems to be stuck at home and not getting care for what they need. The treatments of the 19th century. Restraining. Restraining patients. They would prevent patients from undressing themselves and exhibiting sexual behavior, preventing them from harming themselves or others, especially while in bed. While some patients also requested that they be restrained in fear of hurting themselves. As we have an illustration over here on the side, this is the type of way they would chain people, or in some sort of illustration. Now, what is the con? Nowadays, we can see a potential problem. Like in the past, this could be used as a tool to mistreat patients, and at some moments where they are neglectful to the patient, which could lead to more violent outbursts or harm. In the year 1829, a patient known as William Scavenger was found dead from strangulation. He was in a straitjacket while in bed and was not supervised. This was shown as an outrage and allowed people to better understand the concept of how would you feel like if you were straitjacketed and just left. It's like leaving a child in a crib for hours on end. Now, whether he be a grown man, it doesn't matter. A man named William Toke set up a retreat called the York Retreat in 1792 with the goal of treating their patients as human beings and less a prison and more therapeutic. He wanted to reduce the use of physical restraints, but it wasn't really put in effect until after the death of William Scavenger, where at the Lincoln Asylum, and the grandson of William Turk, Samuel Turk, who published a book called The Description of the Retreat, which popularized the more moral treatment. People need to understand that in this day and age of the 19th century, of that era, people do not see the life in a patient. If something's wrong with you, you are not the norm. You're not fit for society, aka only the strong will live. That was still They were still coming out of that stage to where, hey, instead of everyone having to fend with themselves, we can fend for each other. The treatments of the 19th century. Ice baths. Surprise ice baths were used to treat raging excitement. So, strong libido. They would proceed to dump ice cold water on patients. This would cause the body to have a cold shock response, which leads to rapid vessel constriction in the skin, increased heart rate, blood pressure, and accelerated breathing. and the body is trying to redirect blood flow to conserve heat. Some people will gasp, but also might even panic. So, doing this to patients who might have already had problems with their mental health and ability to control such actions, then causing them to panic, this would not be ideal for anyone, let alone the person in this extent. Now, I understand the concept when it comes to this. When you're trying to prevent the blood flow from going to, you know, the thought process that's creating these sexual desires. But as stated, that if the patient has no control of his receptors, or in the sense he's not able to control his impulses, this could very easily cause them to act out extremely violently towards a person. And plus, it's demeaning. It's, I think, at some point, and I hope I'm not the only one, I've seen where people would spray dogs for doing a bad thing. And when I see that dog, I see a person that is being, who's cold, who's frightened. If that makes me more human than most, then I understand that. But also, this type of action would not be addressed. Now, are there variations of this? Have they, adapted and created better therapies using a similar concept of a type of body response? Yes, we've read about them in class. This pretty much falls under the shock therapy classes. The treatments of the 19th century: sedation. Sedation. There are multiple ways of sedation that was used, like, again, like spraying water on patients. We've talked about that previously with the ice bath. Now, this is a good representation. It's just spraying them until they stop doing what they're doing. It's a conditioning measurement. And then there's drugging. Now, the concept of drugging, anesthetic and stuff to put people under, just like in this current stage, it was still in its infant stages, but does not mean there weren't anesthetic or any type of sort. I try to get the good representation of some sort of anesthetic. One good similar concept, which some people might not know, is it's depriving. If you deprive the person of oxygen to where they would pass out, makes it a little easier for them to go under. Now, I do not believe that's what this person doing, but that could be a great representation of what that man is doing to the man in the chair. Now, they would use drugs to sedate patients, but in some cases, um, and we've seen it where mothers would do it to their children in some cases when they feel overwhelmed, they would drug up their patients to zombify them or put them to sleep. Now, the goal was more of you using this medication to nullify their actions so they wouldn't be more violent or have strong outbursts. But when all you're doing is just putting them to sleep or zombifying them, you're not really treating them. You're just making a husk that walks around. Or there's just something that's taking up a bed. You're not treating, you're just ignoring the problem. And unfortunately, in this day and age, and until we get close to the 21st century, this is very, very common, to where most hospitals use mental ill patients as just a sort of free labor. Now, the treatments of the 19th century: isolation. Now, isolation was also a form of treatment, where at the time there was a belief leaving patients with nothing but their mind, but unfortunately being isolated made it worse, but in some situations required because of self-harm and harming others. Like in many situations, when you are leaving someone who's coming from a home that was either neglected. I do, that doesn't mean that was always the case, but also you are now sending them to be in a room that they're not familiar with in a scary place, whether it be padded or a brick wall. It's terrifying, especially if this person would be in the form of not that intelligent, a low intelligence, borderline, what we would no longer call, but in the state of this time, mentally retarded. Now, I'm using that term as not a derogatory term, but I'm using that as an educational, to where this person, he goes from one place in hopes that, or going from one place where his caregivers, parents, whether it be family, are either more of, I can't take care of them, y'all seem better, but instead they don't want to deal with them, so they would isolate them. And when you're already taking someone who's already in a panic state, especially if they're suffering from mental health, it's not helpful. Now, we obviously see the problem with it of leaving right here. Now, leaving a person with a potentially damaged mind, but leaving them to try and heal on their own would just have a tendency to make it worse. Nowadays, we see where multiple times, like solitary confinement, is done almost destroy human psyche. We have seen that on multiple occasions to where it has taken many people with extensive therapy who've been locked in a solitary confinement state where the only communication they have is between a guard and a cell block door. They lose their mental break, and it does not take long. And that's with a sane mind, a mind that could be strong. Now think of someone who's not that mentally sane. Which, when you make someone who's already not that sane experience what we would think is a dangerous and that messes with the human psyche, you're more likely going to make a more feral human who is going to be more violent and more tendency. And at the time, instead of, oh, maybe we should stop doing this, they're just going to lock him in there, which is just going to make him worse, and eventually he's going to perish, either through giving up, hurting himself, or attempting to escape. The difference between the times of the 19th century and the 20th century. In some situations, families unfortunately would send women to an insane asylum, usually because they are causing trouble. And that term trouble should be more in quotations, um, because one, like this, it says this could be from rebellious teenagers to people suffering from like a postpartum situation. Unfortunately, women were considered property at the time. Not until around the 20th century where women were recognized as human beings, and so they would be sent there to kind of get rid of them. Now, that always the case? No, there are some situations to where maybe they had mental problems, they needed to go to treatment facilities, but I think we can find many stories, diaries, and other times to where uh, a husband or a father is either they either disappointed in their daughter, or the husband just does not want the wife anymore. He wants to go marry someone else, so they have them admitted to a hospital and just forgets about them. And it sounds sickening. It sounds cruel, but well, there is no but. It is cruel. It's just at the time, this was most likely a norm. Um, and like I said, like leaving patients nothing mind. It just makes it worse. This this is just Similarities in the adaptations between 19th century and the 20th century mental health treatments. Now, that was the 19th century. How has it changed in the 20th century? Well, it began with the creation of most psychology studies. Itself has its own issues. We have a list of treatments. We talk about what treatments they have been transformed. Treatments are no longer being used in the 19th century to new ones, and see how they intended to believe but reveal the consequences of said treatment. Treatments would be discussed is that would be discussed is using insulin and wrapping patients in a wet blanket and preventing them from moving, which we will talk about in another slide. In the 20th century, early psychologists thought through enough time with just thought could help repair the mind. The concept could be related to fixing a broken bone. It's more of if you're preventing movement for arm, you can't obviously pick up anything with your broken arm or anything, and eventually over time it would heal. So if you prevent the whole body from moving, all the power goes to the brain, right? Now, we see that and go, that's not going to work. But if you look at it from their perspective, well, this is how we heal wounds when you're sick and everything. This is just another disease. This is another illness. We call it a mental illness. So this thought process, while we see it as, no, this is dumb, this is idiotic, no, you have to realize you have to put in their shoes, because the amount of knowledge we have today is one because of them, through trial and error. And unfortunately, that had to do with human guinea pigs in this sense. It's highly sadistic when it boils down to it. But treatment, every treatment, every cure, every medication out there, it had to go through some sort of trial phase. A good example would be with smallpox. The earliest stages of smallpox, the vaccination wasn't even founded until close to the American Revolution. And the concept was, one doctor took a gamble of pretty much taking a scab from an affected human, crushing up into a powder and rubbing it into the bloodstream of an uninfected human so he could build up an immune system. That was a complete gamble at the time. But I don't know what his thought process were. At the time, people are probably looking at him going, "You're insane." So through these trials and errors, we learn from these mistakes. Obviously, the restraining of patience, we adapt, we change for it. So okay, now we're not using chains, we're using blankets. All right, we're not going to restrain them with chains. So they're iron and they're cold, they're rough and they're rigid. Why don't we wrap them in a blanket like we wrap a baby with the warmth of a blanket? Not a bad concept. But I think if many kids, especially if you're not an only child, they have been rolled up in what we call a burrito, where is you get rolled up in a blanket. And from many experiences, it's very claustrophobic. We'll get into that with the next slide. So, the treatment of the 20th century, hydrotherapy. Now, as you see right here in the bathtub, you'll see three men and a fourth man in the bathtub. And it looks like he is being, one, held up by some sort of suspenders while floating in the water, but in a blanket. They would soak the blanket with water, whether it be cold or warm. There were various treatments of this hydrotherapy. They proceed to wrap the patients with them and kind of restrain them with it. As some experience in childhood, like I stated before, we could see how being trapped in blankets could easily cause a panic and an elevate or increase the heart rate of people, and in the same outcome with the ice cold shock response. With that response, it's putting the body in a panic scenario. Now, there are variations of this, and they have increased upon this. Um, I don't have really much when it comes to it, but this would follow under in the sense of right now we call this hydrotherapy. This is more of like a physical therapy. In the hydrotherapy, at least when I read it. But we could classify the blanket method as more of a shock therapy, especially with the ice cold therapy, similar to the insulin coma therapy. Um, at the time, they had just discovered this fantastic medication that helped cure these people who were in this coma stasis. Now, for people that aren't familiar with the medication at the time, at one of the main hospitals, at one of the main mental hospitals, correction, there was a ward where there had coma patients who, in turn, were actually diabetic. But at the time, we didn't have really insulin. And at the time, it was seen as an hey, you have this disease and it's incurable, and eventually you're going to go into this type of vegetative state where you're going to go in a coma, you're going to slip in a coma, and we can't do anything for you. And as the process, they managed to get this hormone called insulin. Now, for people who are not familiar with insulin, insulin is like a key that unlocks the door that lets other hormones in, aka glucose. Your pancreas is the one that's supposed to form it, but when you have diabetes, it has trouble creating the insulin. And so, as it was discovered in 1921, uh, they when they injected it into these patients, they had woken from this coma stasis. So now they're like, well, this could help. This could help mental health patients because at the time when these coma patients, they were in a mental hospital. So what is the knack for not trying? So doctors attempted to distribute the patients in hopes of solving some of the patients for some to lead patients from suffering from convulsions or accidental comas. Now these were classified as convulsion therapy or coma therapy and being classified as shock therapy. But as I see it, in my personal opinion, and I know I should be more putting it a medical opinion, is accidentally putting in your coma and calling it therapy, I really would not want to call that therapy. Now, have they expanded on insulin coma therapy? Yes, they have. And eventually it was a safe method where they did electroconvulsive therapy, which is also another branch of shock therapy. But they did eventually stop the insulin coma therapy in the 1960s. Um, so that's kind of the concept with a lot of medication, and especially with the treatments in psychology. There's a superstitious when it comes around it. Then you have these people out here. It's like, well, we got to try something. We can't just sit here and watch these people suffer. And so, as much as we see what they're doing is cruel now, someone has to do these. Someone has to do this. Um, it a very great saying is, how do you think they found out which mushrooms were safe to eat? Someone had to try them. And unfortunately, in the situation that we're reading from these treatments, we're watching patients eat the mushrooms. Here's another very, very controversial treatment. And this is lobotomy. Um, Now, this is probably the well known out of all treatments and responses. Um, and it was used by many people. It kind of made a zombified human. Um, in the 20th century, it was popularized. They did see improvement in some cases. Whether it be true, and in those cases, they did see some issues, like obviously you're messing with the brain. So obviously you're causing damage to the brain, seizures, cognitive impairment, personality changes, or even death. Now, messing with a person's brains in the hopes of controlling their outbursts of violent tendencies. But when you're, I know they don't physically saw a person's head open, but uh, you can't, with that picture alone, I tried to get the best picture I could, but that's a needle. Um, that's, ugh. And you're messing with an organ that controls all organs. Like their response for the breathing, the swallowing, the thinking. And at the time, you could not do a brain transfer. It's not pretty much if you had any form of disease that involved with your brain, the fatality rates were through the roof. Um, and so the outcomes just didn't end well. And the treatment was eventually discontinued in the 1950s, and it probably was for the better. Uh, Now, I've seen on multiple cases where they had people would use this on family members when they didn't like what they were doing, which I I can't condone. That is cruel. Now, as we progress and deal with mental health, we and with most situations, we attempt to do experiments. Like we said, who's going to eat the mushroom? It will have effects and lead us to a brighter future. And unfortunately, that is very true. Um, like in the 1950s, people in mental health were not taken care of and were looked at through hateful eyes, and it still lasts today. It's superstitious around the subject. To this day, uh, parents, especially people from the boomer generations and the millennial generations, especially like early millennials, they don't see mental health as a real problem. They sit there and look at depression. Oh, you're just complaining about the issues, about the problems. And while in the sense it was more of how they were raised and how they were shown how you treat something that's different and, you know, not taking accountability for your problems, we now see it as, hey, look, these are real problems, these are real issues. And many people suffer from these issues. And without correct help, it could make your life harder or almost impossible to live. And we slowly, every day, we surpass these issues, but we are going to still suffer them for days on end. Whether it be to the superstitious, to how the media presents itself, presents mental health, how the government presents mental health. As we slowly take steps and strides towards a better future, eventually it's going to lead to a point where we have to keep pushing and pushing. We have to fight for that change. Now, the very more well common and well known um, mental health is what we known as PTSD. I think this was more the leading cause of a lot of mental health being really looked at. And as we see in this illustration, we see a soldier staring into your eyes. This would be also referred as the 1,000-yard stare. And this would be just a soldier who had completely just zoned out in a sense, shocked. Um, many soldiers suffer PTSD in war times from 1970s to the current day, and that's not saying that before the 1970s that there weren't soldiers that suffered from PTSD. It more was it wasn't looked as PTSD. Um, we had the early signs of PTSD as far as 1915, which at the time was the Great War, or also known as World War One, which we refer that as shell shock, and was later relabeled as combat stress reaction during World War Two. Eventually being labeled as in post-traumatic stress disorder in the 1980s, but the movement for treatment wasn't fully adapted till the early stages of the 2000s, where medication treatment was used on a more regular basis. And unfortunately, there's a superstitious when it comes down with mental health. You have soldiers today that they can't even go talk about their mental health in the fear that they might lose their jobs or get kicked out of the military because they are seen unfit. So they have a choice. They could do the right thing in the sense of talk about their problems, which we want them to do, but their bosses up there are going to go, "Oh, you're not accountable. You're not you're a liability. We need to get rid of you." So they kick them to the side, or they prevent them from being promoted because, "Oh, you went and complained about how bad your day was." This is a real issue that we suffer every single day, and we also suffer it in another form, which we will get later into the PowerPoint. Uh, the controversy of therapy, but is necessary for change. While transitioning the current stage of mental health has changed through time, the thoughts around it has also changed. And now look at a serious problem as we should look at diseases and hope find cure treatment by. Does that mean the system is perfect? No, nothing is truly perfect, but we strive to make it perfect. The mistreatment of patients has changed, but not changed. AKA, like most things learn and adapt. How most things learn and adapt, so does the mistreatment of patients in some sort of verification, especially a form of discrimination. We every single day it just adapts and adapts, and we have to fight it constantly. It will be a never-ending battle. Um, the torture methods, as we see today, are not in effect as much today, at least in Western culture. We try to bring forth these issues of mental health on a global scale. Um, we have seen in multiple standpoints that they use very older psychological treatments and other forms of the country. But that could be more for the lack of knowledge around it. It could be the culture norm around that treatment. I believe the chaining restraintment, where they would chain a person to the wall, I've seen that as a sort of a psychology treatment. But if we're able to bring knowledge accessible to the people on a daily scale, maybe a sense of humanity and morality could overcome that, and we could maybe better everywhere. Now, with most treatments, they also adapt and used in different settings that best help discover new ways to find mind and body functions and have a tendency to have breakthroughs. A very controversial name in psychology is Ivan Pavlov. Is very one of these people. He's very well known for his unique and sadistic experiments. It wouldn't not be right to say that some of his studies have filled training methods that we use today, such as conditioning. And a lot of different fields we study use them for other purposes. So, in the sense of what his studies had brought forward, we use in other forms. We it's like taking a puzzle piece from another puzzle to create another image. So, so when we go, hey, this section of this treatment's not working out, why don't we like tweak it? Why don't I grab this over here and put it with it? So when you're adding different variables to an equation, eventually they will come to the solution that they're striving for. And so that's an example of Ivan Pavlov. He's one of the first very few people that learn in psychology. And I think that's a very good place to start because that's where most people need to kind of see where psychology really start because people can't get past that. They think at, when they go into mental health that in mental health there was nothing sadistic happening. At some point in every form of history, whether it be training or not, there was some sort of belief behind something and how we perceive it today. But that was because cultures were different, the times were different, and the education was different. Now we learn from those issues. In the later stages of the 20th century, we started making models as systems that we use that cemented a thicker and stronger foundation of mental health and how we see it and treat it. We come to a current date where we evolved a lot in this field. It makes it more accessible, less looked down upon compared to the 20th century, and the treatment is adapted towards patients and various treatment plans, various patients with mental health. Like the DSMN 5 is a great system in the sense like we had the DSM 3, now we have the DSM 5, and slowly but surely we might get to a point where we have maybe something called the DSM 6 in later stages. Now I don't know if that would be our next step or what. I'm just a college student, but when we sit there and look at this, we are creating ways to make it easier to diagnose people, make it easier, like, hey, here are the symptoms. It could be as simple as how most people type in their symptoms into Google. It's like, hey, you could be suffering from a common cold to a flu. It could be as simple as that. But obviously, we're still in the infant stages when it comes to that. We're still trying to get past the bias that people have against mental health. We're striving to change the aspects of the people so that they could seek more mental health on a daily basis. Um, these are very well known Bexar County um, treatment centers. I've actually been to both of these facilities for friends and family to visit them, and I also been a patient at Clarity for ADHD. Um, and like I said, here in San Antonio, we have multiple facilities that help with mental health for kids, adults, such as Clarity Child Guidance and Laurel Ridge Hospital. We should make it to where patients can feel comfortable talking about their problems, get them treatment without having resentment. Multiple occasions where people suffering from mental health don't want to go back to these hospitals because to them it restricts their freedom. The staff can be cruel or have negative effects with treatment, so they will have a tendency to refuse help or do anything in their power to not be admitted. If we could tweak the system to better benefit other people, make them feel comfortable with the change in treatment goes through, um, so they feel comfortable and come back to a norm. So, um, similar to like rehabs and similar to mental health, one, the leading cause for people not going to seek mental health is the accessibility, the money that involves when it comes to it. The other thing is, um, I didn't hear much about this at Clarity because at Clarity their whole goal was you're going to meet people that are going through similar things like you so you can group. It was all about group therapy, talking about your problems. Hey, you're not alone. Laura Ridge was a complete 180 from as far as I know when it comes to mental health in the city of San Antonio. If your treatment has not gotten better at Clarity, they actually have a tendency to send you to Laura Ridge Hospital. Every person where I've seen with very severe mental health problems have gone here. And the reason why they go to the this facility, one, they have psychiatrists all around. It has full on staff. Um, I went in there to visit my brother a couple times, and it felt like a luxury prison. There were security doors. There were there were a lot of things to prevent one, the patients from harming themselves, and it doesn't show in this picture, but if you were to now look at this building at a different angle, there is now a 15-foot long fence with barbed wire on top. That doesn't scream a hospital in the sense. Now, obviously, I understand the purpose is to kind of prevent someone from escaping when they're trying to get treatment, but that doesn't. To me, that looks terrifying. Why the hell? Why would I want to go there? And so, we have in the situation where you have patients that go there and they don't want to go back because they've been the atmosphere or the treatment. It's just they don't want to do it. They don't want to go back there. They're terrified. And there have been on multiple occasions and some case studies that I have read on in just Bexar County alone to where people have taken their own lives just to prevent themselves from going to this hospital. It's sad to say, but that's where we need to kind of create a change in that aspect. And we can use that in the similar to rehab because most people don't like that as well. And with with mental health and rehab, they have very similar aspects when it comes to it. Um, it it's a it's a very depressing thing. And then there's a weird oddity that also comes to this, where you have people that go to these places and they never want to leave, and which is not a good thing. Your goal is to treat them and be able to so they can go and live their lives and not have to come back for relatively any reason. That is at least the ultimate goal. But unfortunately, you have some people that they will do everything in their power to stay in because they don't want to go back out. It's simpler. They don't have the responsibilities half the time. It just, and they're around people that make them feel better, who've been in their shoes, who understand what they're going through. It's hard. And so if we can find a way to make these facilities a little better, I believe Clarity has a very good idea, but from going from Clarity to Laurel Ridge is a drastic change. And from every patient that ex-patient I met, including family and friends, it's been negative, especially about Laurel Ridge. And in some cases, I've seen occasional lawsuits that come with how they mistreat their patients. These are my citations, and